Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
The reality is that in early 1951, as Richard and I were shocked to discover, the world came very, very close to nuclear Armageddon.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Please follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss a single episode. The Korean War is often called the Forgotten War, a brutal, complex conflict that claimed millions of lives but has largely faded from public memory, particularly in the West. Yet its consequences are still very much with us today, shaping the geopolitical fault lines on the Korean Peninsula and beyond. In their latest book, Korea, War Without End, Richard Dannett and Robert Lyman challenge not just the memory but the understanding of the war, arguing that much of what we believe about Korea is incomplete, misunderstood or dangerously simplified. You'll hear why this war has been forgotten, why it mattered then, and why it matters now. I'm delighted to welcome Robert Lyman to our Cold War conversation.
Anyone who says that they know what they're going to write when they start a book is a liar. We thought that we were going to start writing a book about the British contribution to the UN cause in Korea in 1950, and unashamedly to hit the 75th anniversary of the start of the war, which was 2 days ago. And we went away for the first 3 months just to read up. I went away to read the official histories of the ROK, Republic of Korean official history of the war, and the American official histories, which are a really racy read. They're fantastically descriptive stuff. And then a little bit more boring British official histories. And we came back together after 3 months, he reading a lot of secondary sources. And we looked at each other and said, actually, we don't want to write a history of the British Army in Korea, not because it's not interesting, not because it's boring, but because there's a much more interesting story to tell, which is how on earth do countries end up in war in the first place? Because this Korean War was a bizarre war. It was a bizarre war when it started. It was bizarre in its prosecution by both sides. Both sides really made horrendous mistakes in the prosecution of the war. And it was really quite bizarre in the way it ended, or indeed it didn't end because the war formally hasn't ended. As we were writing this, bang went the 22nd of February 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. And after a few months of this, Richard being particularly linked into what was going on in Ukraine for various reasons. And we were sitting down on one occasion, he said, Robert, it's as though the Ukraine war has been run by the Kim family. So similar are some of the parallels between what you might call the strategic hubris, the mistakes that were made at a strategic level that led Putin to think that he would be welcomed in Ukraine with open arms, or at least that there would be no opposition, exactly the same as Kim Il-sung in June 1950. And some of the really, really daft operational, so military mistakes made in the campaign planning in 2022 by the Russians, really, really bizarre, were made also by the Kim family or Kim Il-sung in 1950. And then, of course, the greatest parallel actually is how it ends. So we don't know how Ukraine's going to end, but Korea at least does give us an example of how wars can end not by means of ultimate victory for one side or the other. And this is a really, really important lesson for everyone who studies warfare, and I've been doing it for a very long time now, as indeed has Richard. And we spend a lot of our time, during this book, we spend a lot of our time talking about what victory means. And the best advice we can give to any generals who are contemplating going to war is fix your strategy. Determine what it is that you want to achieve. In developing your strategy, think about some alternative options should plan A not succeed, and you need to then adopt plan B. And one of them is how you get out of it. Now, it's very, very interesting that in Ukraine, Putin has never given a moment's consideration to how he gets out of it. And I think we all understand why. He's charged into this because he thinks it's going to be easy. He's charged in it because he hasn't actually thought about the consequences of losing. He's charged in it because he thinks that in the great balance of power between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine is a minnow, and Russia's not. But in all those things, he's come undone. And this is the key issue. We don't know what's in Putin's mind. We don't know what it will take for Putin to draw stumps. Will it be 2 million casualties? We know he suffered 1 million casualties so far in 3 years of war. He suffered more casualties than the British Army suffered in 5 years of war in the First World War. And Joe Stalin and now Putin are very happy to throw lots and lots of people at the problem. And blood is not an issue. We don't understand that. And that's the first thing that we've got to get into our heads. All the things that I've been talking about in terms of Putin, Ukraine, are direct parallels with what went on in Korea. And it's a very long-winded way of answering your question about why we gave it the subtitle we did. In short form, the war is still continuing. There has been no formal end to the war. There is a cessation, essentially a cessation of hostilities agreement signed in July 1953. But the world is still at war with Korea, or I should say Korea is still at war with the world, and that's an important distinction. And without going down to a rabbit warren, it's very interesting to ask the question, why is that the case? Why does Korea think it necessary for that war not to be settled? And I think the very simple answer is internal or domestic political reasons. It's very important for North Korea to be able to, for the leaders of North Korea, Kim Il-sung's grandson, to be able to frame the North Korea's relationships with the world in the context of battle. So he's defending North Korea, he's defending the North Koreans from these rapacious Westerners. And for that reason, Korea is very, very interesting. So it's interesting because, not just because the war hasn't ended, but because it does give an indication of how the war in Ukraine might end. And it also gives a domestic justification for North Korean polity today.
Indeed. I mean, the Korean War is generally seen as forgotten in the West. Why do you think that this war particularly has sort of slipped down the cracks of the West's collective memory?
It's a very interesting question. It's definitely forgotten in the West, but it's not forgotten in Korea and China. I'll come back to that in a moment. When Richard and I started out in the book, I was accompanying my wife shopping in a nearby supermarket, and I was a bit bored, so I went out. And this worked for some strange reason. I stopped and I asked passers-by in Bracknell, which is not very far from where I live, whether they could place in history 5 battles. I started with Waterloo. I basically wanted to know whether they said yes, they'd heard of it, and who was fighting whom. I did Waterloo, I did Balaclava, I did the Somme, El Alamein, and the Imjin River. Now, most people got Waterloo. They had a vague idea that the Frenchies were the baddies. And very few people got Balaclava, but that's fair enough. Everyone got the Somme. About 50% of people got El Alamein. Some people hilariously got it wrong, but that's to be expected. But fascinatingly, no one got the Imjin. I had some really, really interesting responses. I interviewed, I think, 59 or 60 people very, very quickly. And, you don't normally expect people to stop when they're accosted in the street, but people were very happy to chat to me. This weirdo asking me about battles. It's very interesting that no one in Britain really remembers the Imjin River. Therefore, they don't really understand the Korean War. It was a long way away. It was largely peripheral to the rebuilding of Britain after the Second World War, so far as people generally consider it. It didn't involve large numbers of troops. At the most, Britain and the Commonwealth deployed a division of troops. So we're talking about 25 to 30,000 men, although over the 3-year period, a very large number of British troops served in Korea, both in the air, at sea, and in the land. And it was a very significant war for lots and lots of reasons. I'll come to some of those reasons in a moment, why it's been forgotten. One of them possibly is the fact that actually, although we have tried to call it a limited war, this is historians and strategists subsequent to the war looking back at it and saying, yes, it was a limited war, and then engineering an explanation as to why we in the West limited it to the use of conventional rather than nuclear weapons, and is therefore seen as a good war. That's actually a false narrative, by the way, Richard and I were quite. We walked into this book thinking that it was a deliberately limited war because that's what we've been taught as soldiers. That's just not true. Um, and it's also because at the same time as the war in Korea, other really big things were happening, not least of all the start of the Cold War, the whole point of your podcast. Um, so was the Korean War the start of the Cold War, or was it the product of the Cold War? Well, it's clearly the latter, but it was the first hot war of the Cold War, and it was the first time in which, hot metal began to fly between the two. But there are some really interesting distinctions that we come to. Um, and it's worth just pointing these out at the moment. We actually come to the conclusion, it's not formally presented in the book, it's nudged at in the book, but we talk about it in our presentations, is that the Korean War was actually the last big campaign of the Second World War. Because most people win that, and me as well, when I've spent my life rather, studying warfare, and I've always regarded the modern security infrastructure that we all exist in the West and across the world, of course, with the United States being the material, political, and economic and military anchor to Western security, the foremost expression of which, of course, is NATO, as beginning in 1945. And yet that's not true. America, after 1945, began a very, very rapid process of demobilization and disarmament, began retreating back to homeland USA to revert to a pre-1941 position of essentially isolationism. And it was their commitment, their military, or their treaty commitment with the Republic of Korea, which in June 1950 forced them to respond to the invasion of South Korea by the North and committed them militarily to Korea. It wasn't NATO. It wasn't their post-1945 strategic imperative. There was no such strategic imperative. They were, as I've said, withdrawing in unto themselves. It was Korea which began the building of the international security structure that we know and love and understand, not the Second World War. And that was a really, really interesting finding for us. Because, of course, I think most people just assume that the Americans, after they won the war, then became the guarantors of peace. It's just not true. What is true is that there was a process from Fulton in Missouri in 1946 through to 1949 in the establishment of NATO, where the United States were increasingly committed contractually, i.e. by treaty, to the idea of collective defense in Europe. Now, this is a really important point for us because this is the first series of collective defense agreements that the world had ever seen. The Article 5 idea that if you attack one member of the collective defense organization, in this case NATO, all the other countries will come together and regard the aggressor as being an aggressor against them. That's really fundamental. That's one of the reasons why we had the Second World War, the absence of a collective defense treaty. Incidentally, it's the reason why we had the Ukraine war in February 2022, because the only country, it's not entirely true, but let me just make the point. The only country that Ukraine actually had a treaty with was Russia. There were treaty obligations made in 1992, I think it was, when, or maybe slightly later. I'm just a little bit iffy on my dates here. It might be as late as 1996, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, and that absence of nuclear weapons was guaranteed by the United Kingdom, amongst other countries. But the point here is that in 1949, when NATO was formally established for the first time, it was done on the basis of collective defense. A few months later, a treaty was signed between the United States and the Republic of Korea, of course based in Seoul, as a quid pro quo for the withdrawal of American troops from Korea. American troops had, of course, gone into Korea in the first place in October 1945 in order to disarm the Japanese. No other reason at all. The separation between North and South Korea was simply a device to disarm the Japanese and repatriate the Japanese Manchukuo army, Kwantung army, back to Japan. That all done, the Americans were then going to withdraw. Americans stayed there longer than expected because of the intransigence of the new regime in the North. Stalin was not going to let go of what he had grabbed hold of above the 38th parallel. But the important point here is that America and the Republic of Korea had a collective defense agreement. So a few months after NATO was formed, a few months after the world's first collective defense agreement, this is a big difference with something like the League of Nations, which was essentially a talking shop with no real commitment. We have NATO. A few months later, we have the North invading the South. Now, if you're sitting in Washington and you've got a strategic bent to your thinking, and you're sitting in London and you're Clement Attlee and you're the new Prime Minister, you're the wartime Deputy Prime Minister, you understand strategy as well as anybody else. You've been through the 1938 Munich process. You understand the implications of appeasing a country like Nazi Germany. The first thing that happens when you hear of the news that these North Koreans, under Soviet control, have invaded the South is that this is another Munich or something similar to Munich, where an aggressor uses military aggrandizement to seize their objectives. Now, running in parallel with all of this is the United Nations, which was Clement Attlee's baby. Clement Attlee put a lot of political stock in helping to establish the United Nations as a new organization in the world that would guarantee or prevent the onset of this sort of war, precisely the sort of war that we saw in June 1915, the sort of war that we saw on the 1st of September 1939 when Nazi Germany invaded Poland, which was a war of aggression or a war of aggrandizement, as it's originally titled in the United Nations in the documents that constructed the UN. Aggrandizement is the word. Basically, what it's setting out is to say that the only type of war that is legally permissible in this new world, overseen by the United Nations, is self-defense. You are not allowed to invade another country for your own purposes. Now, there are subsequent to that, there are a number of legal let out, or that's not the right word, but there are allowances for war in cases of humanitarian disaster or abuse and so on, so long as the war is proportionate. That's what the lawyers will have us believe. People like Professor Nigel Bigg has written extensively on this in his own work. But essentially, the United Nations existed to prevent wars of aggrandizement. Here we are, a few years after the United Nations has been established, months after the NATO has been established, and we have a Soviet satellite country, North Korea, using precisely the tool that has been banned by everybody to unite the two Koreas under communism. And this was patently illegal. Everyone saw this as an illegality. And when Clement Attlee looked at it, without any prodding from the United States, Truman, of course, was the president, took over from Roosevelt, who died just before the end of the Second World War, said, and I paraphrase here, "I will not be regarded by anybody as a Tory appeaser." So he was not going to have Munich placed on his watch. And he responded immediately to support United Nations and American action to send troops to Korea. Remember also, this was only a few years after the end of the Second World War. No one in their right mind thought that there would ever be a war of that kind again. Certainly the Americans, they moved to a Pacific mentality very, very rapidly because they couldn't conceive that anyone might want to use war as a Clausewitzian tool of policy ever again, because Clausewitz had been proven to be an unintelligent component of the modern international environment. Clausewitz said that war was just another tool. And so when Napoleon was invading Russia, he wasn't actually invading an enemy. He was trying to persuade a friend, the Tsar, to apply sanctions against Britain. This was a tool of international diplomacy. It wasn't war. He didn't see it as war. And yet by 1945, 1950, this idea that you could use war and the loss of blood and treasure to achieve your diplomatic purposes was regarded by every sane and sensible person, certainly in the West, as a nonsense. So the moment we saw it being used by North Korea, it was stomped on. And that's really the reason why the world, 18 countries, in fact, under the United Nations, came together to ensure that this bad behavior by Kim Il-sung was punished.
It's really interesting that you say the Korean War is the last campaign of World War II, because obviously you're on the wrong podcast, if it indeed is. But we'll carry on. Now, what was the North Korean and Soviet rationale for starting the Korean War? What did they think they were going to achieve, and what did they think the reaction was going to be?
Well, just going back to the first point, it is both. It is certainly a campaign from the Second World War, but it's also the first hot war of the Cold War. It is the anchor for the Cold War. It's the thing that actually gave the Cold War its rationale. Here we have bad behavior in Europe with the Berlin blockade as a warm war. It wasn't, shots weren't fired between both sides, but it was a threat by Joe Stalin against the West. In Korea, the West regarded the invasion by the North as a direct threat to the integrity of NATO, the integrity of the West, security of the West, and a very present evidence of the danger of Joe Stalin, and the capstone of Churchill's warnings, first articulated publicly at Fulton and Missouri. Now, going to your point about Kim Il-sung, it's absolutely fascinating to realize how much he got it wrong. Kim Il-sung actually was a moron. And I think he'd spent quite a lot of time in 1949, early 1950, trying to persuade both Stalin and Mao Zedong. Remember, Mao Zedong had only won his civil war against Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang government the previous October 1949. And neither Mao Zedong nor Joe Stalin were interested in prosecuting a war in Korea. Stalin particularly said, "I do not want to fight the Americans. This is the wrong war and the wrong time." And Mao likewise was just, he was just recovering. China was just beginning to recover from a long-running civil war that you could actually say went all the way back to 1910 and the end of the Qing Empire. And China wasn't united. It was incredibly impoverished. And this was not the time for war. But Kim Il-sung kept on banging the drum, both in Moscow and in Peking, and was eventually given grudging permission by Joe Stalin to invade, so long as he guaranteed two things. The first was the Americans would not get involved. And the second was that the war would be over very quickly. And Kim Il-sung went back to Mao and said, look, the Americans are not going to get involved. The Americans in January 1950 had left. There was a few remaining soldiers and training teams with the Republic of Korea Army. But actually, there is no evidence that the Americans are going to come back. And indeed, in February 1950, there were very strong indications that from public statements, the Americans wouldn't support the Republic of Korea were there to be a war. Now, that was a miscalculation by Kim Il-sung because it was completely wrong. He went to Mao. Mao said, okay, do it if you must, but do it very quickly. And the Kim Il-sung had lots of Russian equipment left over from the Second World War. So he had lots of T-34 tanks, but his troops weren't particularly well trained. They were trained sufficiently to launch a sort of a blitzkrieg attack very quickly down the main motorways, following the tanks, not really fighting left or right, in order to be able to secure the whole of the peninsula very, very quickly. And so it began. But it was very interesting. Kim Il sung made a very serious mistake in not understanding what the West would do. So, in our view, regardless of the fact that America actually had a collective defense agreement with Korea, I mean, I have to say it's probably not a collective defense agreement. They had an agreement to support South Korea if it came to war. The Kim Il sung didn't know this, and he took a huge gamble thinking that he was on pretty solid ground. But he also didn't understand the Munich mentality. He didn't understand that Truman and Attlee would look at this and see it as rampant aggrandizement of the very nature that they had struggled so hard to establish the United Nations and NATO to prevent. This was the very thing that NATO was designed to stop, and it was proof positive of the Soviet Union's bad officers, so their determination to break the rules and to put themselves first and to ignore international law. Now, let's not get down this rabbit warren because international law is a very contested place. But in terms of how the West saw international law between 1946 and 1950, its primary prerogative was to prevent war. And the first thing that was illegal was not war itself, but aggrandizement of the kind that I've just described. So here we have Kim Il sung not doing his homework, charging into war, and making the first mistake, which was absolute arrogance about how the Americans and America's allies would respond to this sort of aggrandizement. I mean, I might add also, he made lots of operational mistakes. So I called it a blitzkrieg. Well, it was a blitzkrieg in the sense that the invasion was undertaken from Sunday, the 25th of June, 1950, on the basis of fast-moving columns along the few Korean road that led south. And Kim Il sung had started advantage. But after they had passed Seoul, they captured Seoul very quickly. Seoul's very close to the 38th parallel. They crossed the Han River underneath the 38th parallel, and they started making with the south. Their operational plans began to unravel because they didn't go for a core or a single objective. And the core objective should have been the port of Busan, now Busan. Instead, Kim Il sung spread his army out to attack the entirety of the peninsula with the crazy idea that if you captured all the territory, you would win. But we know that that's nonsense. That's like, creating a linear concept where the idea is maybe if you capture every ounce of ground, you will win the country. He would have won the country had he put all his effort into focusing a Schwerpunkt at Pusan, and he would have got there before the Americans had a chance to reinforce it in July and August.
Yeah, no, indeed. I mean, how did the North Korean and South Korean forces stack up against each other at the start of the war?
Well, the first thing to say is the Republic of Korea soldiers most of them were trained by the Japanese. There's a very interesting dynamic here, which is that between 1945 and 1950, the rhetoric in the North is that everyone left in the South, everyone serving the Republic of Korea and serving in their army is a Japanese stooge. Now, the Japanese took Korea as a colony in 1910, very rapidly imposed its own culture on Korea, made the speaking and teaching of Korean illegal, appointed its own apparatchiks to the civil service and the military and so on. So that, by the 1920s and 30s, everyone who ran anything in Korea was effectively Japanese or considered themselves part of Japan, and they naturally looked not to Seoul or Pyongyang, but to Tokyo. Now, when that all ended in 1945, the reality is everyone serving in your army had been trained by the Japanese, had been part of the Japanese Kwantung Army. And the point here is that in the North, they used this as a stick to hit the Republic of Korea with, as being puppets of the Japanese. They were simply um, Stockholm syndrome puppets of the Japanese. So we had there was that very very considerable um, criticism of the Republic of Korea in practical terms and in terms of capability. The North Koreans were much much more capable than the South Koreans. South Koreans couldn't understand why they would need military forces except for invading the North. The idea of defending themselves from the North themselves didn't really um, occur to them. That's what the Americans were for. But of course, once the Americans left, they left a little bit of equipment, they left some training advisors, but they didn't leave them with armor and they didn't leave them with heavy artillery because they were afraid that the South Koreans themselves, under a returned exile Syngman Rhee, would use them to attack the North, which is bizarre when you consider it today. But they were concerned that Syngman Rhee would try and do his own invasion of the North in order to unite the South under the polity of Seoul. In terms of military capabilities, as I said, the North really very significantly outstripped the South. The South, some very, very good men in the Republic of Korea Army, and throughout the war, the ROK Army fought as well as it could be expected, in fact, better in many cases. And some of its officers, senior commanders, some were rubbish, but some were very, very good. And I have to say, you just need to look at the process of battle through the Korean War to realize how good some of the ROK commanders and their soldiers were. But in the early days, as I said earlier, the North had starter's advantage, a little bit like the Germans in Poland, the Germans in Plan Yellow in May 1940. They had and a bit like the Japanese in Malaya in 1941, they had starter's advantage. And if you have starter's advantage, you've got the advantage of surprise, you've got the advantage of pace, you've got all the advantages over the inertia of the defenders who aren't expecting you and haven't prepared fully for you. And that's the case in 1950. The only reason why the Republic of Korea wasn't overwhelmed, I mean, Seoul fell within a few days, the Han River was crossed within a few weeks, and by the end of the month, pressure was mounting on Busan, around which a perimeter began to build. And in all the battles that led to the Busan perimeter in August and September 1950, the ROK and its American and British allies came off worse. But as I said a while ago, some very significant operational mistakes were made. And instead of creating a pointed spear at Pusan, and doing what Rommel always told his soldiers to do, which is boot them, don't splatter them, Kim Il-sung's army spread out to occupy all the ground going down the peninsula, and it slowed them down. And it gave the Americans time to reinforce the Busan perimeter and for the first British troops to come in from Hong Kong. 2 battalions of the 27th Brigade arrived in their summer uniforms, not really knowing what was going on. A political commitment to the United States and the United Nations war effort by Britain from the Hong Kong garrison. It itself was a worry because they were there because they had arrived in Hong Kong to reinforce it, given Britain's fears about the new communist regime in China, which of course was a new threat against Hong Kong. So all these dynamics swirling around that need to be taken into account. And by some considerable fighting, dogged defensive fighting, the Americans and the Republic of Koreans managed to hold the Pusan perimeter. Wouldn't have been held forever. I mean, the fighting went on until early October 1950, and large numbers of Americans started flowing in. But this itself really brings to the fore the reality of what happens in battle when you're not prepared for war. And the Americans in 1950 were not prepared for war in any shape or form. And the Korean War took them massively by surprise. The vast majority of their experienced soldiers from the Second World War, of course, had gone back home and had reintegrated themselves into American society and culture and the economy, and were very reluctant to be recalled to the colors, as many of them were. The army after 1945 and 46 was populated or the American army was populated by men who were joining in order to get an education. And this is it was by no means unique in armies, but people didn't join the army because they wanted to go to war. They wanted to prepare for war because war was, by this stage, an aspect of history. It wasn't something that people took seriously. And so we had a whole bunch of soldiers who were there because the United States Army gave them university credits, and some of the early accounts of the fighting which we describe in the book, and the first prologue, for instance, really demonstrate some really shocking examples of failure in battle. And it's very interesting, when we were writing this book, looking at 1950, Richard and I sort of looked at each other and said, this is very, very similar, of course, to 1940 in France, where we were fighting an army with one hand behind our back. That hand behind our back was our failure to understand how the Germans, in that case, were fighting their war. We had not followed, we had not developed between the wars the doctrine necessary to refight a peer adversary in an intensive way as we had done at the end of 1918. And so when it was done to us again in 1940, we were shocked. We had no idea what was coming our way, and we couldn't interpret it. We had what we describe in the book as a lack of imagination. Now, that's precisely what happened to the Americans in 1950, but that's not the whole story. Fortunately, because one of the extraordinary things about the American involvement in 1950 was just how quickly they were able to turn things around. And in 1950, things were turned around in two ways. One is that troops started getting better, more artillery started coming in, troops started learning from their mistakes. But actually, it was the big operational success of the Incheon offensive that decapitated the North Koreans and should have brought the war to a close, frankly. That's our conclusion. We thought most of the Korean War, was entirely unnecessary. The first war, and we actually break in our book, this is where we diverge from a number of other historians. We describe the war as not being in two phases, but actually being two distinct wars. And the first war was that war which Kim Il-sung had initiated in June 1950, and which ended at the Incheon landings in October 1950, when the North Korean army was comprehensively defeated by MacArthur's brilliant operational move, by landing troops behind the North Koreans at Incheon near Seoul, and forcing battle in the North Korean rear. Really quite a really gutsy move, dramatically successful, and a really good example of how battle at the operational level, also the campaign level, can often lead to strategic victory. That was all thrown away when the Americans then decided, without much thought, to invade North Korea and to do something that the North Koreans themselves had been trying to do to the South, which was to unite the two countries in the peninsula under one polity.
How did the UN and the UK feel about invading North Korea?
This was why it was important for the United Nations to determine what their strategy was, and they didn't do it. It was all done on the hoof. It was done very, very quickly. It was done in an absence of thinking, as we describe it in the book, a lack of thinking. And here we follow some well-trodden path in terms of strategic thinking. And the strategic thinking I'm referring to is that which says you must always set out your strategy and your path to that strategy. And that was not done for operations in North Korea, the race to the Yalu, from October to December 1950. And because it wasn't done, no thinking was applied to what might happen if the Chinese became involved. So the law of unintended consequences, the bane of all strategists, came fully to the fore in October, November, December 1950. The reality is that when the decision was made, and it wasn't by MacArthur was strongly supportive of it, but the decision to advance into North Korea and advance towards the Yalu River, and to bring North Korea and South Korea together was made on the assumption in Washington that the North Korean army was dead, that the Chinese wouldn't come in to support the North Koreans and attempt to reverse the situation, and the war was going to be over soon. And all that North Korea, all that the Americans needed to do was to occupy North Korea, get up to the Yalu, stick their flag in the river or on the riverbank, and it would all be hunky dory. And this would be done before Christmas, 1950. And thereafter, all the United Nations needed to do was perhaps patrol the Yalu River and protect North Korea or Korea from the Chinese and let Kim Il sung just get on with it. But these were all massive and ultimately horrendously mistaken assumptions. Throughout all this period, Mao Zedong had been telling the United States through the good officers of India that if an American boot set foot in North Korea, it would be forced to enter North Korea in support of its ally, North Korea. Those warnings were entirely discounted in Washington. And if they were really considered at all in London, discounted there at all. But there was very little consideration in London of the consequences. I think everyone felt that because China was just recovering from the war, their own civil war, what could they do in North Korea? But it was a fundamentally profound mistake of huge proportions. Just going back to what should have happened. What should have happened is that this war that the United Nations had entered into in support of the victim, South Korea, in June 1950, was a righteous war. It was a war to right a wrong. It was legal, it was proportionate, and ultimately in October 1950, it was dramatically successful. Thank you very much. The troops should have then gone home, reinforced the 38th parallel and gone home, because war in those circumstances and also today can't achieve, unless you're very lucky. This is the important thing. Unless you're very, very lucky, you shouldn't set out to use war to achieve your political goals. This is the whole point that Clausewitz is dead. But the United States in particular reverted to this Clausewitzian idea that actually we've got a way of achieving the political unification of Korea. Let's just use the army. We won't need to advance operationally into North Korea. We just need to get in our vehicles and drive to the Yalu because the North Koreans are dead. There's no one else around. The Chinese certainly won't invade. They were proven completely wrong because within a matter of weeks, upwards of 1 million Chinese were flooding into North Korea. And you all know the story. The Chinese pushed the Americans and the British back down, back beyond Seoul. Seoul was recaptured again over the Han River, over the 38th parallel, and started pressing them, the United Nations troops, in February and March 1951, into the center of the country. And all the gains that had been achieved the previous year looked likely to be lost because of this fundamental strategic error, not considering the possibility that China would enter in vast numbers, not considering the law of unintended consequences. And as a strategist, you've just got to sit there and say, is it worth it? Just at this point, worth saying that when this same point or challenge or problem was posed to George Bush in Kuwait in 1990, he said, we're not going to have another Korea. We are going to go to the Iraqi border and stop there. And that's the lesson he learned from Korea. Don't push your luck. Your strategy is to throw the Iraqis out of Kuwait, reinforce the Kuwaiti defenses, achieve the status quo ante bellum, achieve the point at which existed when war began, and go no further because you have no remit to do anything other. And as a consequence, we had then had a second war, a very different war, a war not between the United States and its allies and the North Koreans, but a war between the United States and its allies and the Chinese. So this is why this is a second war. It's not a second phase of a war. It's a new war the North Koreans are out of it now. They're only involved insofar as the negotiations with the United Nations at Pyongyang um, to bring the war to an end. And even then, they were puppets of the Chinese. This was a war between the United States and China, and that's why it's fundamentally a different war, and also a war supported very strongly by Joe Stalin until he died in March 1953. And that's really why we get to this situation, why we get to the overreach of American power in Korea, because it is an absence of thinking. No one's actually thinking that this is going to be anything other than a Saturday and Sunday job, a walk in the park, and so on. But it leads to some very, very interesting behaviors. And I think for us, the most significant behavior was that exhibited by our friend Douglas MacArthur, who was the Supremo in Tokyo. And he, when he was given the orders from Washington to advance into North Korea, didn't apply a tactical plan for the occupation of North Korea or for the drive to the Yalu. It was basically that the army was split into two parts. One part went on the left-hand side, one part went on the eastern side, not in a tactical formation at all. When what appeared to be Chinese troops appeared out of the mist on occasions in mid to late October 1950, they were dismissed. Those sightings were dismissed out of hand as being wrong. No one in MacArthur's headquarters would actually accept reality for what it was. And there was a fundamental problem for MacArthur, because in the months that followed, MacArthur lost confidence in his army. He lost confidence in his army to stop to stop the Chinese coming over in very large numbers. And as a consequence of losing confidence in his army, he began to aggressively assert the need for escalation. Now, in the context of 1950, what does escalation mean? Well, it means two things. First of all, it means massive aerial bombardment of North Korean and Chinese targets by American air power, B-29s, with conventional weapons. But it also meant a second thing, which was the use of atomic bombs. America, by this time, 1951, had 369 bombs. They'd been assiduously manufacturing them since 1945 and using them against China. Now, there's a real problem here, isn't there? You either use your conventional forces to control the battle and to own the battle and to prevent escalation and create, therefore, a limited war, context in which we've always subsequently regarded the Korean War, or you escalate to atomic war. And the reality is that in early 1951, as Richard and I were shocked to discover, the world came very, very close to nuclear Armageddon as a consequence of this race to escalation. And of course, if the United States, fighting on behalf of the United Nations, had used nuclear bombs against Peking, only 500 miles from the Yalu, then the USSR, of course, which had exploded its first device the previous year, would also have then started, almost certainly, getting involved. And we wouldn't be having this podcast today, Ian. And that's how close we came to nuclear war in 1950. And it's been forgotten. So when Richard and I were talking about this being a forgotten war, it's forgotten, yes, in terms of its actuality. It's also forgotten in terms of its consequence and how close we came to Armageddon. But it's covered up a lie. It's covered up the lie that Korea was a deliberately limited war. Korea was a limited war by accident. So how did the West get out of this escalatory challenge? Very simply, MacArthur was sacked and he was replaced by General Matthew B. Ridgway. Now, Matthew B. Ridgway was a brilliant soldier, and I've always described him as the American Slim, Bill Slim. He was a very smart, intelligent man, and because of time, I just simply say that he very, very quickly recovered the United Nations armies, recovered the situation on the battlefield. Effectively, by this stage, the Chinese Sixth Offensive had run out of steam. Matthew B. Ridgway counterattacked, pushed the Chinese back across the Han River to the point of the 38th parallel, and then sat on the parallel to re-establish the status quo ante bellum, the point at which the war had started. So we're now 2 years in. Actually, no, we're not. This is July 1951, so we're just over a year in. It's been a bit of a seesaw experience so far, but we are finally back on the line that we were in October 1950, and the Chinese have been stopped. That's really, really important. The next 2 years was effectively a process of persuading the Chinese that they could not unify Korea, they could not beat the United Nations forces in battle. And that required a soldier like Matthew B. Ridgway and his successors to win the war on the 38th parallel. So Matthew B. Ridgway, let's just go back to the start. Douglas MacArthur had lost confidence in his army and therefore began to talk about escalation and to advocate escalation. Matthew B. Ridgway demonstrated that the army could do what was necessary to stop the Chinese on the 38th parallel, and therefore escalation was not required. So the whole need for massive aerial bombardment of China was no longer on the agenda. The use of atomic weapons against China was no longer on the agenda. Actually, the use of B-29s against North Korea was still on the agenda, and it was carried out. Devastating effect, unnecessary effect, in Richard and my view. We don't believe most of the B-29 destruction of North Korea was necessary or wise. That's another subject. We deal with that in the book. But Matthew B. Ridgway's demonstration of the power of battle to achieve a strategic effect is really, really important for us. And it's a useful reminder that deterrence is not just something we need to consider in terms of nuclear weapons. Deterrence is something we need to consider in terms of having effective conventional forces that can prevent the need to escalate. If you don't have those conventional forces available to win your battles, like that battle in that long battle between July 1951 and July 1953, you're forced to consider escalation. And if you've got nuclear weapons, the ladder to escalation to nuclear weapons is a very easy one. So they're only a couple of steps, and that's very, very dangerous. One of the things that we sort of came to the conclusion about, it does build on the work that Richard and I did for Victory to Defeat, is the idea that we are incredibly naive in our country and in the West generally if we think we can deter an aggressor, a potential aggressor, on the basis of the continuous at-sea deterrent, CASD, or the fact that we have nuclear weapons, because it means that if we have to respond, we've only got them to use. What we need to have is deterrence on a conventional basis, and that means having strong conventional forces to demonstrate our willingness to preserve the status quo ante bellum against any future aggressors. So, I mean, the whole process of the Second Korean War is really, really helpful to us in terms of understanding Ukraine, which is where I started. And the lessons for us today are we in the West cannot rely on, and NATO can't rely on the fact that we've got nuclear weapons to deter Russia, because he's operating under the nuclear threshold. We can only deter him by working in a united fashion with strong conventional forces and the conviction and the commitment to use them if necessary as the sub-threshold beneath tactical and strategic nuclear weapons, a lesson we learned in Korea. But it was men like Matthew B. Ridgway who taught us that lesson. And the best thing Truman ever did, frankly, the worst thing he did was to allow American forces to cross into North Korea in October 1950. The best thing he did was to sack MacArthur. MacArthur had been a brilliant commander in the Second World War. In his island hopping campaign, the Americans shared the Pacific theater. They divided in two. MacArthur had basically the southwest up to the northwest on a triangular basis, and Admiral Nimitz had everything above that. And he launched his sea campaign accordingly. And MacArthur was a fabulous supremo in Japan after the war, and operationally, the attack on Incheon was brilliant, quite extraordinary. But he had significant strategic limitations, and that's where he had that was his Achilles heel. Everyone's got one. And 1951, we discovered what MacArthur's Achilles heel was, which was strategic hubris.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's worth noting that you've got quite a number of personal accounts interspersed between what I would call the grand strategy narrative in there. And I particularly enjoyed the one with the lieutenant at the Battle of the Imjin River, which reminded me of the episode that I've got with Tommy Clough, who was at the same battle and was captured by the Chinese. It's episode 174. I'll add that to the episode notes.
Oh yes, you mentioned that. Well, do you know what? This is really interesting. We as I said at the start, we didn't know what we were going to write, and we then after 3 months we then realized what we want to do is write a book about how wars start, how wars are prosecuted, and how well they're prosecuted, and then how they end. But of course, you've got a ground war, and not on a grand strategic narrative, but on what happens on the ground. And so what we did is we divided the book into 3 parts. There's a prologue which describes American actions with American troops on the ground in the very early days of the war, and demonstrates, we think, pretty well how inadequately prepared the Americans were for modern war, and then we had a second prologue, which does the same for the middle of the battle, middle of the war, and then we had Dennis Watmore, lovely Dennis Watmore, a National Service lieutenant, who was at the Battle of the Imjin River. And the Imjin River, I mean, it's very interesting. It was interesting to challenge my own prejudices, because for many years in the British Army, when I was a young officer and so on, and I taught things like the Imjin River, I was a little bit suspicious that this was just a little bit of British military hubris and regimental fluffing, because the Imjin River really wasn't a strategic battle at all. And yet I was absolutely wrong. The Imjin River battle, in which the Gloucesters played a glorious part, was a very significant element in stopping the Chinese fifth offensive and beginning the sixth offensive, and slowing them down and preventing them from getting to Seoul. Another evidence that battles can have strategic consequences. And we didn't go into it in huge detail, but what we want to do is to demonstrate actually how well British soldiers fought. Now, these are British conscripts, effectively, national servicemen. There were lots of regular soldiers, of course, serving as well. In the Middlesex Regiment, there were men serving in the first brigade, the 27th Brigade that went out there with the Argylls. There were men who had been captured in Hong Kong in 1941 by the Japanese, had spent 3.5, 4 years as prisoners of the Japanese, gone back to the colours, served in North Korea, and were captured by the North Koreans as well. I mean, that's quite extraordinary, isn't it? But the 27th Brigade, and then they were converted into the 29th Division, fought brilliantly well along with their Australian, New Zealand, and Canadian colleagues. And these were men who didn't really want to be there, but once they got there, they fought like tigers. And Dennis Watmore's account is quite an extraordinary account. And I was actually on holiday with my family, and I had this challenge by Richard, so we divvied the book up, and my challenge was to go away at this stage in the writing and write about the Imjin River and to pull it all together, which is quite a challenge. I had lots of help from people like Alan Mallinson and so on, but I found Dennis Watmore's account. I think Alan might have sent it to me, and I read it and I was mesmerized. I thought, this captures in totality what I'm trying to explain. I wrote to his family, Dame Sarah Watmore, very distinguished academic in Oxford, immediately wrote back and said, Rob, of course you can. We'd be absolutely delighted. So it's quite a chunk of the prologue, but it tells the story brilliantly. And again, as I said, it anchors what we're describing as grand strategy, operational planning, with in the reality of the hard fighting that actually war is all about. It's about the man on the ground and the woman on the ground actually fighting in the mud, the blood, and the gore for their lives and for the tasks that have been set them. So we didn't want to we didn't want to move away from that. We wanted to make sure that people walked away from the book with a good sense of, how desperate on occasions this war was for the fighting soldier, how tough it was. I mean, climatically, topographically, Korea offered quite considerable challenges to soldiering. I've spent a lot of my career studying the war in Burma, and Burma is not a place anyone would volunteer to fight a war. And Korea is the same. I mean, you go to Korea, it's mountains. I mean, the spine of mountains running down Korean Peninsula is quite extraordinary. It's the last thing you want to do is to fight. But they did so, and they did so brilliantly. And that's actually part of an exciting part of my discovery, my journey as a soldier, was to reverse my earlier prejudices against the Imjin River and the stories I've been told about the Imjin River, because it's even bigger and more brilliant than I'd ever anticipated. Really exciting story.
I think having those personal accounts in there just gives a nice bit of balance to the book. Are there any accounts by Korean veterans in English on either side, or even Chinese veterans?
Yes, to both camps. Not North Koreans that I know of, but there are certainly quite a few very good South Korean memoirs. In fact, this was not a problem for us. There's quite a lot of really good stuff. In fact, the real problem was the fact there was too much stuff to research. We could have been doing this for years and years and years and years. In terms of research, NARA in the United States and Washington and the Truman Museum, much of the archive is now online. It was absolutely fantastically helpful. But there are some very good South Korean memoirs in English. And there are a few Chinese ones. There are quite a few Chinese ones in Chinese, one or two now in translated into English. The big challenge, of course, we have with the Chinese is there is actually a lot of material in Chinese that has never made it into English. Not just for the Korean War, but for all the wars that followed it, including the Second World War. I went to a symposium on the Chinese army in Taipei in 2015 and was absolutely amazed to discover how much written material in Mandarin and Cantonese was available from veterans of the Second World War, but academics like me, I'd never ever accessed them, nor had the means to access them either. And I think that's the big opportunity for historians of the Second World War in the Far East. And people like friends of mine, Rana Mitter, for instance, who's written China's War, able to speak and read Mandarin, has access to that material and has been able to build his narrative of the war in China around it. Well, that's what I would encourage historians of the Korean War to do the same in terms of the repository of Chinese material. But there's lots of South Korean stuff. I mean, just go back to the point. Actually, right at the beginning, you said, is the war forgotten? Well, it's not forgotten. It's a lived daily experience in South Korea. It's not so much a lived experience in China, although China have not forgotten it. There are some wars the Chinese have forgotten. They've forgotten their invasion of Vietnam in 1979, but they have not forgotten Korea. It's a very important part of the narrative they preach about their war against the capitalistic West, and this fits very nicely into that. But in Korea and South Korea, no, they are armed and ready. They have not forgotten the war. A very interesting little segue here. When we were writing the book, we approached the South Korean embassy in London, who were delighted that we were writing it and gave us lots of help. And we had a conversation with them about the fact that the war's forgotten here, and they told us that in 2014, because Britain had long rebuffed any request by a number of requests by the South Koreans to set up a memorial to the British soldiers who had served in Korea, and the South Koreans in 2014 said, "Oh, blast, we'll just give you the money." So they paid for the memorial in the MOD Embankment Gardens and had it put up as a lovely memorial to the Korean veterans. That was put up by the government of the Republic of Korea, not by the British government.
Wow. Post 1945, it's one of the highest number of casualties the UK's had in any war.
The casualties in the war are worth just touching on. I mean, I mentioned the point that Richard and I were horrified about the use of the B-29 bombing campaign against North Korea. If I was to tell you that the population of Korea reduced by between 18 and 20%, largely as a consequence of aerial bombing, the Curtis LeMay policy of aerial bombing from March 1945 to August 1945, Japanese cities, was adopted, lifted lock, stock, and smoking barrel and applied to Korea, again by Curtis LeMay, who is in command, without much thinking. The idea was that this was a war of people. This was a war against North Korea. North Korea needed to be obliterated in the same way that the Japanese economic complex had also been destroyed. Remember that in Japan and North Korea, the war economy was not based around large factories. It was based around home production. And so if you destroy home production, you actually remove the factories. And this was applied to North Korea. But it was done in a devastatingly and disproportionate way, the extent that about 3 million people lost their lives as a consequence. As I said, nearly 20% of the whole of the North Korean population. At any one stage in this war, there were 6 million men and women fighting on both sides. 6 million. This was a very big war, which again raises the question of why it's been forgotten. And I don't really have the answer to that.
You have been listening to Robert Lyman, who co-wrote Korea, War Without End, with Richard Dannett, published by Osprey. There'll be links in the episode information showing you how to buy the book and support the podcast. The episode extras, such as videos, photos and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.